Metropolis. The word conjures up images of climbing towers, bustling streets, a hive of human activity on a scale as grand as any that can be imagined. Metropolis, from the Greek, having a not too inaccurate translation of the mother of all cities. But even the mother city must have been birthed herself at one point, and so too does the picture that bears its name. Where did it come from, and how is it that a nearly 90-year-old film is still having an impact today? Let's go back to the beginning and see the foundation for this place. Metropolis owes its existence in many ways to two important events: the growth of Expressionism in art at the dawn of the 20th century and the First World War. Expressionism was a movement that grew as a reaction to the naturalistic works that were so prevalent. Things were painted as they were, or as they would look. Its precise definition is hard to nail down, because it's incorporated elements of other styles into it, such as cubism or surrealism, but generally, you can think of it as distorting the world so as to convey thoughts and emotions. While art usually strives to invoke something in its audience, Expressionism wasn't polite about it. It wasn't afraid to metaphorically pick its nose and slap you across the face. It would grow to affect not just art of the canvas variety, but literature, plays, and yes, film. The movement in Germany predates the war, actually, generally considered to have started with the 1913 film The Student of Prague, although it's debatable as to whether that was a deliberate attempt on Rye's part or an attempt to emphasize the horror aspects of this adaptation of Edgar Allan Poe's William Wilson. In either case, the movement was already beginning, but what would help this along was, yes, World War I. The most obvious reason is that, far and away, the largest producers of films was the UK, France, and the big one, the United States, which could be listed as those guys Germany are at war with. So as you can imagine, there was a dearth of foreign films coming in during the war years. The German government threw its support behind the German film industry then, in particular to support propaganda. The entity which eventually emerged from this was the UFA, or UFA, which, as the war began drawing to a close, was able to shift from a propaganda factory to a proper film business. And one thing that UFA was interested in was promoting German Expressionism. This was in part due to wanting to be seen as the promoter of German art. But more than that, it was the fact that post-war Germany was a bleak place. They were a nation that had lost so much, sent so many of its young men out to die, or to return maimed, or just broken in spirit. Rye, the director of the aforementioned Student of Prague, volunteered to fight for his adopted nation and died in battle for a war that nation lost. What this did was move the Expressionist movement into mainstream culture, because these films reflected in many ways that which the populace itself was feeling. This allowed more of such films to be made, and with grander budgets, so that soon the rest of the world was taking an interest in what they were up to. These films captured the imagination of audiences. The Cabinet of Dr Caligari, The Golem, Dr Mabuse, and Nosferatu are just some of the groundbreaking works to emerge at the beginning of the 1920s. A director of one of those films, actually, and responsible for today's outing, was Fritz Lang. Austrian by birth, he had been living in Paris when the war erupted, and in the face of war-related rioting, chose to flee back to his native country via Belgium without even time to acquire a passport, clutching a revolver in his pocket the entire way as he feared having to shoot his way past hostile foreigners to return home. Paranoid, perhaps, but his record once he enlisted showed incredible courage, and he was showered with numerous promotions as well as medals and commendations for valor in service of Germany during the war. But when he was wounded and suffered temporary blindness, forcing him away from the action, Lang took the time to write down story ideas. Crime novels, werewolf tales, the fantastic and the horrific. He filled out a journal with these ideas. He sold 2 stories based upon his crime novel ideas to film developers, and thus was born his grand film career, yes? No. Having recovered, Lang leapt back into the war again, continued to earn distinction with his valor until he was shot for a 3rd time, and finally felt enough was enough and was removed from active duty. Despite his devotion to serving Germany in the war, once it was over, he never seemed to look back. Unlike many who inflate their achievements such as these, Lang actually downplayed his involvement. It's from others that we learn about these escapades, not Lang himself. he just didn't want to think about that stuff anymore. Like many, he escaped the horror of the war by entering the horrors of the imagination. While writing scripts for Joe May, the man who bought those crime stories, Lang met Eric Palmer, a producer working at a studio that was soon absorbed into UFA. Palmer and Lang really hit it off, and eventually, when Lang expressed dissatisfaction at the way his scripts were being directed, Palmer allowed Lang the chance to do so himself. Lang had been studying as much as he could about film during this period, and had such success that he was actually first choice to direct the Cabinet of Dr Caligari. But he was so obsessed with his work, Spiders, a two-part epic film about a secret organization called the Spiders, that he passed on that. The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari would go on to be the linchpin expressionist film, and everyone and their uncle would claim a contribution to its final result. Lang, too, did. He claimed to have developed the framing device used in the film, a claim that is both simultaneously dubious and confusing. Given his involvement with Spiders, it's unlikely he would have been free to revise the script, as he said. And what's more, he was basically taking credit for what was generally considered to be the worst part of this film. It would be like you claiming you invented New Coke. You probably didn't, and why would you want people to think that you did? In Lang's case, it was likely to emphasize that, while his involvement with UFA associated him with German Expressionism, he himself was often resistant to it. And yet, a great deal of the success that allowed him to make his films was thanks to the fascination with German films because of that. And elements of German Expressionism did wind up appearing even in Metropolis. It was Joe May who introduced Lang to his future wife, author Thea von Harbu. They clicked as creative people, working together on projects to the point that they became lovers, even while her husband was appearing in the work that they created. Lang himself was married at the time as well. He was a bit of a cad, which is a nice way of saying cheating asshole. He often wasn't even shy about such things. Not long after his wife walked in on him and von Harbu playing Who Wants German Sausage, she was found shot in the chest with Lang's own revolver. It was ruled a suicide, and all who knew Lang said that he would never commit murder. But after this, there was a new undercurrent to his films on subject, such as the burden of guilt and the way that the innocent are presumed guilty, and the guilty working to conceal what they have done, elements that you're going to see on display even in Metropolis. He and von Harbu collaborated on several works, including the Nibelungen, an updated version on a classic German epic poem. The result was a smash hit. In Germany, it was a moment of pride, a reminder to Germans of what it was to be Germans. And yet it was popular overseas as well. In 1924, Lang and Palmer traveled to New York to witness its premiere there, and there was the moment when the seed for this film was planted. Looking up at the towering buildings of New York City, Lang had a vision that he was gazing into the future. He and von Harbu had already begun work on the screenplay for a film, but that was what crystallized into this, brought the whole vision into focus for the film that was to be called Metropolis. Palmer was convinced that not only was this going to work, but that this would be the film that was going to establish the future of German cinema. He had carefully handled his production with the spending philosophy of, knock yourself out. His reasoning was that they were investing in the reputation of their product, films so visionary that Hollywood could never hold a candle to the quality of them. UFA became synonymous with German Expressionism, and he was now prepared to go all in on Lang's Metropolis, no expense to be spared. The problem was that Lang's grand vision was to cost 6 million marks, at a time when Palmer's go-nuts approach to financing films already left UFA 36 million marks in the red. That's why UFA made a deal with Paramount and MGM, trading plum theatrical real estate in exchange for a short-term investment of 4 million marks, which was then plunged directly into Metropolis. And what's more, UFA expected to actually lose money on the film too. They found themselves in debt, and apparently the plan was to spend their way out. But that was deemed a worthwhile risk as well to establish a mainstream cinematic presence in the U.S. They would be losing a substantial part of their own country's market in the hopes of getting hold of the massive American market to serve as a stepping stone to become a worldwide cinematic powerhouse. The film was both wonderful and trying. Lang was allowed to go nuts, but they were developing new filmmaking techniques just to try to bring that vision to the screen. The miniatures work, for instance, was so out of the norm that, when the film came in for development, the head of the department went in to handle it personally to ensure that this expensive shoot was done correctly, and proceeded to so completely screw it up they had to reshoot the whole thing. They created a technique for the videophone sequence that involved fully synchronizing a projecting camera and a recording camera to ensure that they were always frame by frame complete. And remember, this was while television was in the process of being invented. They were developing new technologies for this film that I can't say are the best things since sliced bread, because pre-sliced bread wasn't invented until a year later. That's the level of technology they had to work with. And yet every obstacle was overcome through sheer bloody-minded determination and, of course, piles of cash. Lang ran the production like a tyrant, such as spraying hundreds of poor children with water that he insisted be freezing cold because he was that kind of a guy. And he would have retake after retake of scenes done until, for example, he was satisfied with the lead collapsing at the feet of Maria, which was easy for the actor to do because by then his legs barely functioned. The story was simultaneously being developed for von Harbu's novel version. She frequently did this, wrote a novel and a film script of the same story simultaneously. And here she allowed something new within. The popularity of the Nibelungen was more than just a mainstream success. It had been embraced by two big fans of it. Their names? Joseph Goebbels and Adolf Hitler. Von Harbu herself began to show more and more leanings towards the National Socialist Party, and would consequently inject a heavy measure of socialism into the film, almost to the point that it seemed in part to be a Russian propaganda film showing the decadence of the capitalist pig and the plight of the working class. The film did so well with the Nazis that once they came to power, Lang found himself in the position of being basically drafted by Goebbels to run German films. And given Lang's paranoia, well, he fled the country that very night. But back to Metropolis, the long and expensive all-in effort to amaze and dazzle the world. It opened in Germany to a reception of, looks great, but the story's a mess. The film was a huge 2.5-hour run, a length judged far beyond what the typical audience is willing to sit through. UFA was nervous, and they weren't alone. Paramount was set to release the film in the US and didn't know what to do with the damn thing. A film that long meant fewer showings, for something that was considered hard to understand even in its own country. They reasoned, if the story is too long, and the story is hard to follow, why don't we just re-edit this thing to both emphasize the beauty of the piece and also to make things easier to follow and fit into a 90-minute runtime? The Seuss liked that idea, so playwright Channing Pollock was brought in to supervise chopping an hour out of this film and having it still make sense. Some of the edits were a marked improvement, actually. Hollywood did have a great deal of experience with this, and the editors found ways to convey the same facts without drawing events out needlessly. But a big chunk of what was done was removing the subtext and nuance of the film. It was hammered into a straightforward, overt narrative instead of the complex and subtle one that Lang had been going for. UFA, desperate to salvage their investment, not only stood by while Paramount reworked the film, they actually made the exact same changes to show it in Germany, and were doing the same thing with the copies being sent around the world. The Pollock version, as it was called, became the definitive version of Metropolis, and would remain so for nearly a century. The irony was that, even with the changes, the critics were still unsatisfied with the film's story. Among them, and this amuses me to no end, was an irate H.G. Wells, writing a long and scathing critique about A, how much it was a complete rip-off of other works, including, unacceptably, his own, and B, what an utter piece of shit this film is. It took him a long time to say that, but trust me, that was his message. He went over this film looking for flaws that even I, as an internet critic, would find excessive. And unlike me, who is doing this because it's my job, Wells did it because he really wanted an opportunity to tell the world how much he just hates this film. Palmer, the producer, was blamed for allowing this catastrophe to happen and was thrown out, and Lang's new boss fired him as well. The film that was supposed to be the great German blockbuster tanked completely, and UFA's board of directors not only signed an agreement that said Lang was never to work for them again, but, and this is how you know you've screwed up, they put a note in the margin of that document that said they were obligated to be rude to Fritz Lang every time they saw him in public. Now that's a grudge. To declare in an official document, you'll go out of your way to act like a dick. UFA tried to get a government bailout to survive, failed, and was bought out by the German National People's Party, who were reluctant partners with the Nazis and like them wanted to use UFA for propaganda purposes. And you know you pass through a wormhole when film censorship comes up in proximity with Nazis and they had nothing to do with it. It's kind of like finding Lex Luthor sipping margaritas while someone's shooting the Pacific Ocean with a freeze ray. It's hard to believe that he has nothing to do with it, but he's as confused as anyone here. Of course, the film over time was seen as the visionary work that it was, and in the 70s, efforts began to try to restore the film to its original glory. They met with limited success, resulting in a variety of attempts at restored cuts, including the 1984 rock opera version because what else would you expect the 1980s to do with it? In 2008, though, the search came to its effective end. In Argentina, a copy of an almost complete version of the original cut of Metropolis was found in a museum. It was damaged, it was on 16mm, but it was 95% complete. Over 2 years, the film underwent a restoration to attempt to clean it up as best they could. In the video, you will notice that these scenes have two important characteristics. They look scratched up, and they're cropped so the things being shown will remain to scale with the existing prints. This restored version was released in 2010 and is the version that I'm going to be using. So with that, let's take a look at this classic work, Metropolis.